8.9 magnitude. Now we know that's a big number. It was the 5th largest earthquake in history. But you can only really understand the enormity when you see these pictures.
Some call it the Great Wall of Japan, a 400-kilometre-long reinforced concrete shield against tsunami waves along the country's northeast coast. It cost 11 billion euros and took years to build.
On March 11, 2011, Japan was shaken by one of the strongest earthquakes ever recorded. Minutes later, a towering wave tore across its coastline, sweeping away entire towns. But the real shock came after the water receded. Vast stretches of land had sunk for good. In response, Japan launched a massive, unprecedented battle, not just to rebuild, but to defend its future. The day the ocean came in. It began just before 3 p.m., when the earth beneath the Pacific Ocean fractured with a force few could comprehend. A magnitude 9.1 earthquake, one of the most powerful in recorded history, struck off the northeastern coast of Japan, sending shockwaves through the ground and the lives of millions. In Sendai, buildings swayed violently. In Tokyo, nearly 400 kilometers away, office workers clutched desks and door frames as sirens blared. But what followed was far worse. Within 30 minutes, the first tsunami waves began to hit. Entire neighborhoods were swallowed in real time, captured on shaky camera footage and broadcast to a stunned global audience. Massive walls of black water surged inland, carrying homes, cars, fishing trawlers, and debris like toys in a bath. In towns like Rikuzentakata and Kamaishi, nothing was spared. The sea did not surge, it invaded. The numbers are difficult to grasp. Nearly 20,000 people lost their lives. Over 120,000 buildings were damaged or destroyed. Nuclear facilities like the infamous Fukushima Daiichi plant failed catastrophically. But even those facts cannot fully convey what it felt like on the ground. The sound of warning sirens drowned by rushing water, the frantic scramble for higher ground, the agonizing minutes spent waiting for a loved one to answer their phone. The disaster revealed a truth Japan had long lived with, but never fully confronted. No amount of preparation could guarantee safety from nature's fury. Yet, in the aftermath, that realization gave rise to something rare. Not paralysis, but resolve. Japan would not simply rebuild. It would rise with a new plan, a colossal wall, forged not just in concrete, but in memory. History's costliest wake-up call. Japan has always lived on the edge of uncertainty. Situated atop the convergence of 4 major tectonic plates, the Pacific, Philippine Sea, Okhotsk, and Amurian, the archipelago endures nearly 4,000 earthquakes every year. Some are gentle tremors barely felt, while others, like the Great Hanshin earthquake of 1995 or the Tonankai quake of 1944, leave behind devastation and scars both physical and emotional. For centuries, communities adapted through elevated homes, strict building codes, and elaborate early warning systems. But on March 11, 2011, all of those defenses were overwhelmed. The Tohoku earthquake and tsunami didn't just break records, it dismantled assumptions. For decades, Japan had operated under seismic safety models that underestimated the scale of potential offshore earthquakes. The waves that hit Tohoku's coast rose higher, traveled farther, and moved faster than most experts had ever anticipated. In some places, the water reached over 40 meters in height, as tall as a 13-story building. More than just physical damage, the psychological impact was profound. Survivors spoke of being haunted not by the wave itself, but by the stillness that followed it. In cities like Ishinomaki and Minami Sanriku, silence hung heavy over the wreckage, the kind that only follows total loss. For weeks, then months, tens of thousands lived in evacuation shelters. Others faced years of dislocation and grief. Faced with this unprecedented scale of destruction, the Japanese government made an equally unprecedented decision. This wouldn't be a temporary fix or symbolic gesture. It would be a long-term, ironclad commitment to protection. If nature was going to bring its worst again, Japan would meet it with something unshakable, a defense system as massive and enduring as the threat itself. Building the unthinkable. By the end of 2012, just over a year after the tsunami, The blueprints were ready. Japan's answer to the ocean's wrath would be a continuous coastal barrier stretching 400 kilometers along the northeastern shoreline. In places, it would rise as high as 15 meters, taller than a 5-story building, and in others, it would adapt to the unique geography of bays, ports, and headlands. But translating that vision into steel and stone would require more than engineering. It would demand ingenuity born of desperation. The first challenge was the land itself. Much of the Tohoku coastline sits on soft, uneven sediment, not ideal for supporting a massive wall. So, before any concrete could be poured, entire stretches of land had to be cleared, flattened, and reinforced. Construction teams dug pits over 20 meters deep, filling them with a dense mix of concrete, steel, crushed stone, and compacted sand to create a stable foundation. Without this substructure, any wall would eventually crumble under pressure from both water and time. To understand what kind of force the seawall might face, engineers studied the 2011 tsunami in detail, even recreating its waves in controlled tank simulations. They also accounted for future worst-case scenarios, adjusting designs with generous safety margins. Energy-dissipating blocks were placed along the ocean-facing side to blunt wave impact. Some sections included sloped facades to redirect water upward and away, reducing erosion. Where ports intersected with the wall, complex hydraulic sea gates were installed. At Iwaki Port, for instance, a retractable gate can lower into the sea to allow ships in and rise again at the onset of tsunami alerts. These systems were engineered with precision, using corrosion-resistant materials and fail-safes to ensure reliability under stress. In total, the wall was more than a defense. It was an ecosystem of protective elements, each tailored to its environment, and it came at a price. The estimated cost approached $13 billion, but in a country where entire towns had been erased in a matter of minutes, few argued that the investment wasn't worth making. The ground beneath their feet. As the seawall began to rise, engineers and geologists uncovered a deeper problem, one the water had quietly left behind. In several places along the coast, the land hadn't just flooded, it had sunk, permanently. Satellite data and ground measurements revealed that some coastal zones, particularly in Miyagi and Fukushima prefectures, had subsided by as much as 1.2 meters, roughly 4 feet. Entire neighborhoods that once sat safely above sea level were now below it. This wasn't erosion. It was tectonic subsidence caused by the massive shift in Earth's crust during the earthquake. The ocean floor had thrust upward, lifting parts of the seabed, while other sections of land sank under the stress. And unlike floodwaters, this wasn't a condition that would recede. It was a new reality. Suddenly, the stakes of seawall construction shifted. The barrier was no longer just a bulwark against tsunamis. It became a line between livable land and the encroaching sea. In some towns, the ground level was so low that entire neighborhoods had to be elevated, using massive volumes of imported soil before reconstruction could begin. In others, residents were relocated entirely to higher ground. This revelation reframed the project. Japan wasn't just defending against future waves, it was responding to a newly reshaped coastline. Every blueprint had to account for the altered topography. Drainage systems were redesigned, foundation depths were recalibrated. Even evacuation planning changed, as roads once considered safe now faced chronic flooding risk. What emerged was more than infrastructure. It was a psychological pivot. The nation realized that surviving a disaster wasn't just about resisting force. It was about adapting to irreversible change. The seawall was no longer a symbol of defense. It had become a monument to a land that had shifted beneath its people's feet. The hidden cost of safety. Despite its monumental ambition, Japan's Great Seawall did not arrive without controversy. As construction surged along the northeastern coast, many residents began to question what was being lost in the pursuit of safety. In places like Kezunuma no Funato, where fishing and tourism were central to the local economy, the towering concrete barrier cut off centuries-old towns from the sea that had once sustained them. What was once a scenic view became a blank gray horizon. For elderly residents who had lived their whole lives watching tides rise and fall, the seawall felt like a prison wall, protective perhaps, but isolating. Small fishing communities worried about the long-term effects on maritime livelihoods. Environmentalists, too, raised concerns about the wall's impact on tidal ecosystems. especially in shallow bay areas where wave patterns and coastal habitats were now permanently altered. Even psychologically, the barrier delivered mixed signals. While some felt relief knowing the seawall stood ready to absorb the next tsunami's force, others felt lulled into a dangerous sense of security. Critics argued that no structure, no matter how tall or thick, could guarantee absolute protection. Nature, after all, does not respect blueprints. But the government remained committed. Adjustments were made to preserve visual access in some towns, and selective breaks in the wall allowed for ports, rivers, and view corridors. Yet the broader dilemma remained. How does a nation protect its people without severing its relationship with the very landscape they call home? The seawall was both a triumph and a trade-off, a feat of engineering built atop sacrifice. It protected, but it also concealed, and in the tension between defense and identity, Japan had to learn that security sometimes comes at the cost of familiarity. Resilience reimagined. Over a decade later, the seawall stands not just as a line of defense, but as a living memory etched into the landscape. For many coastal residents, it has brought a renewed sense of peace, a quiet confidence that their homes and families are no longer at the mercy of the ocean's sudden rage. Evacuation drills are still held. Early warning systems still matter. But now, there's a tangible shield standing between tragedy and survival. More importantly, Japan's bold approach has caught the attention of other nations facing rising sea levels and coastal threats. From the Netherlands to Indonesia, governments are studying the design and trade-offs of Japan's coastal armoring. Some see inspiration, others, caution. Because the Japanese experience makes one thing clear: true resilience isn't about erasing risk, it's about learning from it. The seawall is not a guarantee, it's a promise that the loss of 2011 will not be forgotten, and that the cost of protection, no matter how high, is a burden worth carrying if it means saving lives. Japan didn't just raise concrete, it raised the question, how do you anchor a future when the ground itself can vanish? If this story moved you, share your thoughts below. And if you're drawn to stories of survival and design, subscribe for more just like this.